Okay. Hello, everyone. I want to thank all of those who are joining us today on our weekly Monday sessions. If this is your first time joining us, I want to thank you for joining. If you've been with us for a few of the other live stream workshops that we've done, uh, nice to see you back here. As you know, or maybe you don't know, but my name is Alexander Florio. I'm one of the co-founders of Swab. What Swab is, again, is it's a job app that we've created, but with a specific focus on younger job seekers, students, and sort of high turnover roles. So if you are looking for opportunities, Swab is still a resource that you can use. There are many employers that are posting roles right now on Swab. So even though we're living in a bit of a crazy time, what with COVID-19, employers are still looking for candidates. So keep that in mind. Swab is free, will always be free. So just a resource that you can use. So I think, the last sessions that we've had, we've talked about resume workshops, or sorry, resume, things you shouldn't include. So different resume skills and tips, interview tips we talked about, ways that you can stand out in a crowded job market. So those are all great things that we've covered. But for today's session, and for those of you who have joined, I like to keep these sessions pretty short. I think anywhere between 15 and 20 minutes. 20 minutes is a good length. I really want to be sure to get to the point and make sure that for those joining, you feel like you've learned something, take some value away from these, and hopefully they will help you when it comes time for you to look for a job or start applying. But I think this week's pretty unique, our session and the topic for today. It's great to discuss different things like, what should and shouldn't be on a resume and different interview skills and how to stand out. But today we're doing something a little different. So what we have is some questions from our users that have reached out to us. So I thought I would take 5 of the questions that I thought were really unique questions and pretty common across the board. So I thought I would take those questions and answer them to the best that I can, with just from my own opinions on what I've seen from employers and what they look for when looking for a great candidate. So I have a list of some of the questions here, and I think they're pretty interesting, and I want to get started. So I just want to jump right in. So here was a common question that I got a few times. And I'm not going to name the name of our users that have asked us these questions, but if you do come across this video and you realize that it is one of the questions that you asked, hopefully you'll see this and I can answer it for you. But one of the questions that I was asked was, is it appropriate to show up early to an interview? Now, this is a pretty common question, and I think when you think about going for an interview, this is a pretty there's a misconception there. A lot of people think, obviously, you don't want to show up late, which is an obvious thing, but you also don't want to show up too early as well. You don't want to become a nuisance to that employer where they feel like they have to entertain you or sort of hurry up and finish whatever they're currently doing. So I think good rule of thumb is 10 minutes. If you have an interview and you show up 10 minutes beforehand, introduce yourself. That's a great. I think that's a great amount of time where you're early, but you're not early enough where you're becoming a nuisance to that employer, and things just don't get awkward. Because if you show up to an interview, say, I don't know, a half an hour early or 45 minutes early, and you're just sitting there, it becomes awkward for that employer, and there's already sort of a tense feeling. So definitely 10 minutes is the rule of thumb. So you don't want to be too eager and become or show up to an interview too early, but you also don't want to show up late. So keep in mind around 10 minutes is a good time when you have an interview. So be 10 minutes early and make sure you introduce yourself and give the employer some time to really get their things in order and make sure that they can prepare for that interview. So I think that's a really good point, and I want to make sure that this is something that you for those who are looking for jobs understand that you don't You don't want to be too early, and I want you to think about it as if it was, you on the other side, you as the employer. You wouldn't want to sit there and entertain somebody or figure out something or figure out what you need this person to do for a half an hour or whatever it might be. So I think 10 minutes for sure, good rule of thumb. Let's get to the next question here. So this was a pretty interesting one, and I had to kind of think about it for a second. But the question is, I got let go from my last job. How do I speak to the interviewer about my previous employer? Now, one thing I will say is that's a great question. But one thing that I will say is you never, under no circumstances, do you ever want to throw a current or former employer under the bus. You never want to talk poorly about a previous employer or your current employer. Things that you don't want to be saying are, their upper management was the worst. I simply couldn't work for somebody who disrespected me that much. Or the company I was working for was condoning unethical behavior, so I had to seek other employment. Those are red flags for employers and interviewers. They don't want you to be talking poorly about an employer. And right away, if you start doing that during an interview, it's going to raise some alarms. And those red flags are going to start to go off, and they're going to start asking questions like, why is this person looking for another job? Or what does their previous employer have to say about this candidate? So you really, really want to make sure that you don't talk poorly about a current or former employer, regardless of how that environment was. Because if you start doing that, then it just kind of puts a negative sort of cloud over your interview. And, you just want to make sure you're positive, keeping light, and, not giving the employer that you're interviewing with any reasons to have any sort of negative doubt about you. So certainly you don't want to speak poorly about a previous employer or a current employer. I think you just want to answer those questions honestly. So if you are currently employed somewhere and you don't like that current employer, that's fine, but don't be saying that during the interview. You can answer if the interviewer asks you why are you looking for a new job or looking for a new opportunity, you can be honest and just say, I'm looking for a new challenge or something along those lines, but certainly don't ever speak poorly of the current or former employer. Third question I want to get to. Now, this was actually a pretty common one. And in my time being the co-founder of Swab, and even just from speaking to a lot of employers, this is something that they find quite often on a resume. And it kind of makes me laugh whenever I see this on a resume because it's really not necessary at all. But the third question is, do I need to provide family status on my resume? And these are things that you want to avoid on your resume. You don't need to include, your date of birth, your background, your parents' names, your ethnicity. These are things that you don't need to include. So, and even pictures, don't have pictures. You don't need to include any of that information. It's really not necessary. So for anyone who does have that information that we just listed included on their resume, I would really encourage you to remove that. It's just useless information. The employer doesn't need to look at that. And it's really just not common here in North America to include that information on a resume. So I would encourage to remove it. Even things like references available upon request. It's something that's been debated before where, some people prefer that on a resume and some people don't want that included on a resume. I mean, I certainly wouldn't list off 5 references on my resume, but I suppose it's not necessarily a bad thing to say references available upon request. So, that I think is up to you. But certainly things like, your parents' information, your gender, your ethnicity, your date of birth, I don't think you need to include that. And if you have that on your resume, I would encourage you to remove it. Okay. Fourth question that I got asked, and this was another common one, and I think it's, I think it's a pretty important question. And it's, should I ask about salary or pay during an interview? Now, my opinion on this question is no. I don't think you should be asking about pay or salary during an interview. There's a lot of time to discuss those types of things after you land that job. If your interviewer or the employer that you're going to interview at, if they're torn between yourself and another candidate and you were asking about pay during an interview, it might kind of give some negative feelings towards you from that employer. Not negative, but they might have some doubts. They might look at you and think, well, is this individual really just in this for a paycheck? Or do they really actually want to be here, be a part of this team, and grow with this team? So I think that personally, it's a question that can be discussed later on. But first, I think it's important that you get the job first, and then you can ask those questions later on. Because again, if it's between you and somebody else, and the other person is passionate and not asking these things and is showing a real eagerness to work at that business or that company, they might have the advantage in that situation. So, it's all opinion. It's up to you, but that's my personal opinion. Is I wouldn't ask about salary during an interview. I don't think it's that appropriate, and I think it's something that you should ask later on. Now, this is the last question that I want to get to, and I thought this was pretty interesting because I've never been asked this question before, and it was a pretty unique question. And this might be a question that some of you might have thought about when going for an interview, and that is, how do I respond in an interview when asked about conflict or a conflict? Now, as you work through behavioral questions that you're likely to be asked in an interview, you certainly want to avoid placing blame on anyone else or the previous employer or your management or your boss or whatever it might be, regardless of the situation. Because if you start, blaming others, then again, going back to what we talked about, about pay, about speaking poorly about a current or former employer, is right away there's that negative cloud above you. You just, you want to make sure that if an employer does ask you about a time where you dealt with conflict in the workplace or even at school, you want to answer it honestly, but you certainly don't want to throw anyone under the bus, and you don't want to be blaming other people for problems that you were involved in, because it shows a lack of accountability to the employer. And every employer, every person has gone through a conflict, whether at work or at school. So they'll understand the situation. And I think just be honest when you get asked questions like this. You really don't want to be lying. You don't want to be making yourself seem like the hero and making everybody else look bad. I think just answer the question honestly, and the employer will recognize and see that you're being genuine in your response. And I think that will help. So certainly you don't want to be placing blame on others. You want to take that accountability, and I think employers will recognize that and see that. So I think for today, we're going to cut off our session now. I think we're at about 12 minutes, so I think that's a pretty good time. This was a little earlier, but I really like this. I hope that you were able to find some value in this, but I do like the questions that were asked. So if there's something that you want to see for next week, for those of you who are joining us, by all means, submit your questions to us. We would love to answer the questions that you have. We're trying to help out. We're here to help. And we want to make sure that for those who are looking for different job opportunities right now, for those who might be thinking about new opportunities in the future, that you feel best prepared when it comes for that time. So if you do have questions about what you should or shouldn't include on your resume, or different interview skills, types of questions, whatever it might be, please send them our way. We're happy to answer them. We could do another session like this in the future as well, where we gather some questions, some commonly asked questions, and then I can just answer them with my own opinion. But certainly don't feel like you can't ask, because we encourage that. We want to know your thoughts. Otherwise, I hope that you were all able to take some value from this today. And I hope you all have a great week ahead, and we will see you next Monday. Take care, everyone.